Activision's fans, Ready Player Will here. This is a quick video recap of the Guild War tier list that we did live on stream with our leader of VIP and some of the other veteran members of the group. Thank you again to all of you that tuned in. This is going to be kind of a summary of what we essentially talked about in our tier rankings and some of the justifications, some of the characters, and addressing some of the popular comments that we saw that I'm sure regular viewers would have as well. So very quickly, obviously there's a lot of different ways you can think about a tier list, and so I'm going to go through some of the definitions of how we approached it so that you can better understand the methodology of where we assign them. So first of all, number one, it's for Guild War, regular Guild War, and generally speaking. Obviously, certain maps come into play that completely change what some of these prospective rankings are, but this is a more general overview of things, and specifically for regular Guild Wars, nothing with cost limitations, nothing with certain map effects. And then we really do try to isolate the value of the character themselves, as opposed to just how they function in a three-man team or how strong the vision cards are. That obviously factors some of it because of the practical usage of what you get out of the characters, but we really try to isolate the characters themselves. Secondly, it's supposed to be the present characters, no future implications. So those that get Mastery 2 upgrades or those that are future releases or future vision cards, really try not to take any of that into account. This is, as best as we can, a current snapshot of what we're seeing and what we've practiced with. So for the SS tier, and please, if you disagree with some of our evaluations, I remind you to try to keep the ranking definitions in mind. This is kind of how we try to adhere to things. It's one of the best characters in almost all universal conditions. So that's across maps, across metas, across different balance changes. That's the SS tier. The S tier, some of the best, but a few caveats why it's not as universal. The A tier is really good but has exploitable flaws, and that's a really important one to keep in mind because there's not necessarily a ton of drop-off between the S and the A, but the A characters tend to just have some more flaws that don't make them workable across a variety of different metas, or a variety of different maps, or a variety of different balance changes. B is good, but won't get you very far. It's certainly serviceable. And then C is relatively lackluster, but usable. And quite frankly, there are, I'm sure, characters that are left off that could potentially be C units. And obviously there's an exception for everything, but the goal of what we're trying to speak to here is the top 50 guilds. And I just want to remind everybody, this is not my own input. This is the input of a variety of some of the best theory crafters in the game. VIP is a notorious, undisputed #1 guild for the analysis, the mock testing that they do, the hours they spend stress testing all the different characters in a variety of different situations. So while you may disagree and you may see things differently at your rank or in some of your own tests, I would encourage you just to trust in the analysis of some of the, we'll use the word experts here, on who we brought in for the panel. So I don't doubt there's some that are probably off just a little bit, but I think generally speaking things are correct. So getting into things, first off, those that we ended up leaving off the list, and again, this is for UR units only, I've not included any of the MR units here. Those that we left off, if we're looking here, some of the more notorious snubs, and obviously I'll give you a chance to like pause your screen and kind of look here and pick it apart. Some of the more popular ones that we saw people wanting to get on the list was A, Kane from Final Fantasy IV, and the overall conclusion is really just that he's unfortunately not nearly bulky enough. He gets one shot by way too many things in the game, and just simply having courage isn't enough to actually make a tangible impact in Guild Wars, particularly where you really want to go for more than one fight. And then when you're comparing his old strength, new strength, the game has just changed so drastically in terms of what the tanks are and what pierce resistances exist that he just doesn't get the same value that he once did. Golbez was kind of another snub as well, where a lot of people really wanted to see Golbez on there, but unfortunately the agility levels really just aren't there, and being solo locked to magic type attacks. And then a lot of people were trying to make the case for Orin as an ice unit, and unfortunately there was a time where he was really good and he did have some above average bulk right at the beginning of the EX upgrades, but at this point he's kind of slid back to the norm of things, and given all the other ice slash units and what they bring to the table, Orin just doesn't have that much that really separates him from the pack. He's a little one-dimensional in the heights and the ranges that he can attack with, and although on paper some of his stats do look pretty good and think you get some use out of it, it just unfortunately doesn't scale well with the rest of the game currently. But that's by and large who we left off. I'm pretty okay with what we did here. So now getting to the actual rankings here, starting from the bottom, our C ranked units, which again, if you recall, relatively lackluster but usable. The C units end up being this group right here, and a lot of these units got some special mention because of how well they fare on certain variations of comps on attack, some of what their kit inherently has. Obviously, not all of these units you see used prevalently currently, or maybe even in the past, but that doesn't really detract from their potential and what they actually bring to the table as a character either. One of the big debates here was whether Ayaka should be just a little bit higher here, given that she did get a pretty healthy MA2 upgrade, does function theoretically pretty well in a rainbow comp. But unfortunately, her bulk overall just doesn't really offer enough to make up for it, and her AI isn't as clean as some of the other units where she wants to pocket a certain unit, and unfortunately she ends up kind of pocketing a tank in ways that they don't really need to be, comparative to some of the other healers. Dwayne was also a choice here that some people were a little skeptical of, but at this point in the game, Dwayne's also really just a glorified DPS. He gets 5 innate hate, has no other way to regenerate it, his overall survivability is relatively lackluster, and although he has some good utility in the kit with some of the imperils and the disable potential, it just doesn't make for a consistent attack, and we've tested him a ton right now at the top of the game. VIP is literally running a Dark Wall macro for the last couple days in Guild Wars, and so we have done a ton of testing with Dark, and Dwayne just simply isn't even feasible at that top end of the game when you really put the best you can have to offer. We move on to the B tier side of things now. This was also an interesting one where a lot of people thought Mont should be a little bit higher, and we all consensus agreed Mont, similar to Dwayne, a little bit more power crept at the moment. Doesn't have the survivability that a lot of the other tanks has. Very one-dimensional in his resistances, that he's very weak to magic-oriented things overall. And then just generally speaking about the fire vision cards, which obviously do impact the characters to some degree, and we try to segregate that a little bit here and try not to factor it too much, but it's kind of a elephant in the room that for a character that already needs a little help, he certainly doesn't get that externally. Also a little debate here on Lemure, where people have some hit or miss results with her. The real big thing with Lemure is the Hestaya, and that it's unique to her. Obviously Titus has some access to something similar, but it doesn't function nearly the same, and Titus is obviously a little more confined to being with a water element, whereas Lemure as a time mage and as the Hestaya really can apply to a variety of different comps as well. The benefit to her is really who you're pocketing in terms of the other two units, and she does end up at this B level here. And then finally Garvel got some mention at the end there, where he does fare decently on attack, same with Knight of Ruin Stern, but really not units that you would probably use on defense or in a wall. They just don't have the same consistency, but they do pack enough firepower and do have their good roles that you can certainly target certain units and have pretty good effects to them, but Garvel does lack some of the spear penetration that most magic units need, and so against certain elements in the top end of things you'll see here, he just doesn't get that same overall well-rounded effect. Now when we get into the A tier units, this is where one of the biggest controversies of the night came for, and I am here to talk obviously a little bit more about it. This is our current A tier here, where again, if you consider A tier as really good but has exploitable flaws, I feel like that's a decent definition of a lot of the characters here, and Cloud was the one that a lot of people really thought was supposed to be higher, and I can kind of see why. There's some recency bias where when you talk about Cloud in the midst of the mono light meta with the evasion, he was one of the best units to use, and for quite some time just worked really well with Charlotte and Ibarra. That was a very hard meta to get through, but that's not for all phases of gameplay. He does have some very exploitable flaws. He did benefit greatly at the time from the Ibarra vision card, which helped his overall AoE resistance, but outside of that, Cloud is very reliant upon his reflex to really keep him alive for that extra turn. And then just on that note of bulk, he's got no defense or spirit on him. It has to all come from equipment and espers. So relative to some of the other characters that have increased survivability, he's just not there. And so although you might think he really deserves to be higher, and he does have places where he certainly shines in certain maps where you really get the benefit of the sharpshoot and the range of the ranger subjob, that's not always the case. So exploitable, absolutely. And the same can be said for a lot of these other ones. Azan the Unkillable was another where because of his buffs, he really does tend to move forward and can sometimes get himself into trouble by moving too far ahead of his teammates and not always in shorter maps getting the important buffs off that he needs to. Winter Luartha, kind of similar to Cloud, really high damage upside here, and obviously the mobilize and the range is a big premium, but she is also relatively flimsy as well. Black Rosalena kind of surprisingly too, maybe to some, but she has been a little power crept in terms of what used to make her so oppressive and special. At this point in the game, we have seen a lot of other characters that can use different kinds of imperils, a lot of other characters that have innate ways to bring up their own spirit, AoE and unit resistance, and the subvision card system and Truststone system has really changed the balance so she isn't nearly as oppressive. She's still very good, obviously, as an A tier unit, but not to the level she used to be. And then Joker, kind of surprisingly to some as well. Joker is part of the future dark meta, but it's not necessarily all on himself only. He is an important cog in that comp and providing protect to the teammates, having some of the defense break, having a barrier break, and just having some overall higher survivability in some of the dark counterparts, but he really can't function outside of having Little Leela and in the future Dark Fina as well to really optimize what he can do, regardless of the vision cards, regardless of his kit. And then we do have CTA here as well. That's kind of one that got some notoriety, where she does, sure, have some good utility overall with the fire and peril, but unfortunately, there's just not enough good fire units to take advantage of that. Her damage, unfortunately, just isn't nearly high enough to make a tangible impact on most fights. That being said, the healing power down, as well as the defense break, really do well against what, Velis does overall. And so when we do see Ice have some more relative strength, CTA will be among some of the good fire units to potentially throw into the wrinkle of things. But again, some exploitable flaws, certainly. A lot of ranged characters, Missile in particular, have some trouble when they can do on certain maps. Which brings us to our S tier. Now, our S tier, we're pretty confident. There might be a couple that raise some eyebrows here. In particular, I think most people look at the end of this and see Resnick, Aranea, and Terra and might go, really? And I'll just in reverse order. Terra is definitely here, just on the basis alone that she's got enough general bulk and survivability that scales well across a variety of different metas. The guaranteed hit access, she's got a lot of just good raw damage overall, and a lot of the fire vision cards, which again, we don't weight terribly heavily, but are part of the balance, really are skewed for magic fire units, and Terra in particular, so she does really well to that degree. Aranea, kind of an eyebrow raiser here too, where yes, she does have some potential magic weaknesses, and I think she's kind of a product of the more recent memory of Mono Light, where when you are trying to hit evasion units, you have to stack her accuracy so high that you have to unfortunately kind of trade off somewhere else, and that's in some of her survivability. Once you move away from some of those evasion metas overall, she does still technically have a guaranteed hit in her kit. She's got a ton of amazing utility. Some abilities here, one in particular is Dispel all buffs, Dispel haste, and Dispel courage all in one attack there. She's got decrease of unit resist, an absolute metric ton of defense penetration to be able to tank bust, with access to two of the more undefensible attack types in pierce and strike damage that ends up just doing a ton of damage. So while we move away from the evasion meta, and now you can kind of gear for some of her magic weakness and some of that survivability, she actually is overall a extremely good character that will scale well across the future of things. And then Resnick 2, a lot of people do kind of pigeonhole her as a lightning element only unit, and that might be true in terms of reaching her peak value, but overall her value as a support is far superior than some of the other ones here. One of her big buffs, the Teaching of the Strongbolt, sure, if you use it on a non-lightning unit, they're going to miss out on the lightning attack of 30, but they still get debuff resistance of 30%, single unit target resistance of 25, and then her other buffs to increase defense and spirit. Her insta-heal still is a 25% agility buff and a 40% attack and magic buff while having that instant cure, and then she also has the reduced physical damage taken of 50% to an ally. All of those things are independent of being a lightning unit that she does still scale relatively well, and her limit break obviously being great for also dispelling debuffs and being a big buff and an HP restoration as well. So 3 units that you might have thought been a little bit lower, but they really do have some strong points to stand on, and I think the rest of these do kind of speak for themselves in terms of how strong they are. We have seen Jaden fall off, if only for the presence of Celeste. That will not always be the case though, and he really does have a very awesome niche in terms of a long-range missile spirit unit with a lot of amazing buffs that just synergizes really well with a variety of different light comps you can put together. Which finally brings us to our SS tier, and on a separate tab here, the overall conclusion was this, where again, you consider the definition of the SS as one of the best in almost all universal conditions, and for a fact, Velis, Oberyn, and Celeste are 3 units that are de facto kind of rainbow comp units, that they thrive regardless of the vision cards, regardless of some of what the metas are. You can put them in a variety of different places and they're going to do immensely well. And that's a massive premium. Starlight Elena obviously is a meta-defining unit. They're obviously doing everything they can to balance light so the other elements get usage, and that's because of her strength in particular. And then finally, Astrius is just such a monster in terms of his overall stats and kit, survivability, what he brings for buffs. It just does well in a variety of metas and almost all of the maps. He's not really limited to any of them. And Little Leela, or Dark Leela, is definitely one of the better units as well, where just so much to be said about her AoE dispel, the defense break, her ability to has the healing power down and protect dispel. That's one of the biggest ones here, where you do look back to some of these S-rated tanks. Charlotte and Joom are protect-oriented tanks, as well as Celeste. The fact that she can dispel that really does enable the dark comps to thrive overall. Maybe not as rainbow friendly as some of these other units that we see here, but definitely a potential meta-defining unit that we're going to see as things unfold. And that's the overall tier ranking in the nutshell. Again, this is kind of the image of it at a very high level. I know there are some people that probably still disagree with some of these, but again, this is done with a variety of inputs of some of the best minds in the game. This is not done by me by any stretch of imagination. And it comes with hours and hours of testing and mocking and a variety of different content that the overall knowledge and gut feelings and takeaways that can be applied to Guild Wars as well, I really do think speak for itself. So I'm really happy to see if anyone does vehemently disagree with any of this. I'm sure there are going to be some that in the broad scheme of things, we're probably a letter grade or two off of, but I don't think anything is too drastically out of place here. But as usual, love to hear the comments, criticism, critiques all below, and kind of create that conversation to better figure out why we may think something and you may not, and try to talk about the different gaps between them and why it might be true sometimes for UR, but why it's also not true in the majority of instances when you really look at the characters on paper and in practice of what they do effectively in game. So thanks for watching, everybody, and I will talk to you all soon.